I was born and raised in the suburbs of Tampa, Florida. When our maid, Clara, died in a tragic accident at our house, her family publicly blamed us for her death. But my husband fought back, destroying them in court. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to fight back, because this decision did not just cost me my marriage. It broke the last thread of connection I had to the man I married. My life before that terrible day seemed secure and predictable. I worked as a human resources manager for a healthcare company in downtown Tampa, handling employee relations and benefits administration. My husband owned a property management company that oversaw commercial buildings throughout the Tampa Bay area. We lived in a spacious home in a gated community, the kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes safely and neighbors knew each other by name. Our 2 children, ages 10 and 8, attended a well-regarded private school and participated in swimming and gymnastics. Clara had worked for our family for almost 3 years. She was a woman in her mid-50s who had immigrated from Guatemala 15 years earlier, working hard to support her daughter and 2 grandchildren who still lived in her home country. She cleaned our house twice weekly and occasionally helped with childcare when our regular sitter was unavailable. She was warm and gentle with the kids, teaching them simple Spanish phrases and bringing them small treats from the Latin grocery store near her apartment. My children genuinely loved her, lighting up whenever she arrived and showing her their school projects and artwork. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I had already left for work, and my husband was supposedly at one of his properties dealing with a maintenance emergency. Clara was alone at the house, doing her usual cleaning routine. According to the police report, she had gone into our detached garage workshop, a space my husband used for storing equipment and supplies related to his property management business. Something in that workshop caused her to fall from a significant height, striking her head on the concrete floor. She was found hours later by a landscape crew working next door, who heard our security alarm going off. The paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall from approximately 12 feet. The police investigation concluded it was a tragic accident, likely caused by Clara climbing on unstable shelving or a ladder to reach something high up. They found no evidence of foul play, no indication that anyone else had been present. It was ruled an accidental death in a workplace incident, and the case was closed within 2 weeks. Clara's family was devastated. Her daughter Maria flew in from Guatemala for the funeral, along with Clara's elderly mother. They were a small family, just the 3 of them, plus Clara's 2 young grandchildren who had stayed behind due to the expense and difficulty of travel. At the funeral, Maria spoke about how much Clara had sacrificed to send money home every month, how she had worked multiple jobs to support her family, and how she had been looking forward to retiring in a few years and returning to Guatemala permanently. I attended the funeral feeling genuine grief. Clara had been part of our lives for years. She had cared for my children with kindness. She had been reliable and trustworthy, someone I considered a friend rather than just an employee. I cried during the service, remembering her gentle laugh and the way she hummed while she worked. My husband attended with me but seemed distracted and uncomfortable, leaving immediately after the service ended rather than staying for the reception. The trouble began 2 weeks after the funeral. Maria and Clara's mother filed a wrongful death lawsuit against us, claiming we had maintained an unsafe workplace that directly caused Clara's death. Their attorney argued that the garage workshop had been cluttered and dangerous, that equipment had been improperly stored, and that we had been negligent in allowing Clara to work in such hazardous conditions. They sought compensation for Clara's lost future earnings, pain and suffering, and the financial hardship her death had caused the family that depended on her income. My initial reaction was sadness and guilt. Even if we were not legally responsible, Clara had died while working in our home. Her family had lost their primary financial support. The moral thing seemed to be offering some settlement, helping them with funeral costs and perhaps establishing a fund for the grandchildren's education. I told my husband we should speak with our insurance company about reaching a reasonable settlement that would help this grieving family without admitting fault. My husband's response shocked me. He became immediately defensive and angry, insisting we would not pay a single dollar to Clara's family. He said they were trying to exploit our wealth and sympathy, that they saw us as easy targets for a cash grab. He hired an aggressive defense attorney named Richard Walsh, who specialized in defending businesses against personal injury claims. Richard's strategy was not just to defend against the lawsuit, but to go on the offensive, portraying Clara's family as opportunistic foreigners trying to profit from tragedy. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Richard filed motions challenging every aspect of the family's claim. He argued that Clara had been an independent contractor rather than an employee, meaning we had no legal duty to maintain safe working conditions. He claimed Clara had entered the garage workshop without permission, going into an area she had been specifically told to avoid. He brought in expert witnesses who testified that Clara's death was the result of her own negligence and poor judgment, rather than any failure on our part. But Richard did not stop at defense. He filed a countersuit against Maria and Clara's mother for defamation, claiming their public statements about our negligence had damaged my husband's business reputation. He demanded they pay damages for lost business contracts and harm to my husband's professional standing in the community. The countersuit seemed excessive and cruel, attacking a grieving family who had simply tried to seek accountability for their loss. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended every day, sitting beside my husband and trying to reconcile the man I had married with the person orchestrating this attack on Clara's family. Richard painted Clara as careless and irresponsible, someone who had ignored safety rules and brought about her own death through recklessness. He presented our garage workshop as a clearly marked restricted area that Clara had no business entering. He showed photographs of warning signs that I had never noticed before, signs that seemed too new and clean to have been there for years. Maria testified about her mother's character and work ethic, describing how careful and responsible Clara had always been. She explained that Clara sent home almost all her earnings, living frugally in a shared apartment so her family in Guatemala could have better opportunities. She spoke about the grandchildren who would now grow up without their grandmother's financial support, without the chance at education and stability that Clara had been working to provide. Her testimony was heartbreaking, but Richard cross-examined her mercilessly, questioning her immigration status and implying she was motivated by greed rather than genuine grief. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning their verdict. They found in our favor on the wrongful death claim, determining that we bore no legal responsibility for Clara's accident. But they also found in my husband's favor on the defamation countersuit, awarding him $75,000 in damages. Maria and her grandmother were ordered to pay this sum, an amount that would financially devastate them. They had no savings, no assets, no way to pay such a judgment. The verdict meant they would face wage garnishment, property liens if they ever acquired anything of value, and decades of financial hardship. I felt sick watching Maria and her grandmother react to the verdict. They looked confused and defeated, unable to comprehend how seeking justice for Clara's death had resulted in them owing money to the people in whose homes she had died. Their attorney looked equally stunned, apparently not having anticipated that the countersuit would succeed. My husband, by contrast, looked satisfied and vindicated, accepting congratulations from Richard as if he had won a great victory, rather than destroyed a grieving family. After the trial, I tried to talk to my husband about settling the countersuit judgment, about showing mercy to this family that had already lost so much. He refused absolutely, insisting that he needed to send a message that false accusations would not be tolerated. He said Maria and her grandmother had chosen to attack us publicly, and now they would face the consequences of that choice. He instructed Richard to pursue collection of the judgment aggressively, to garnish Maria's wages and file liens against any property the family might own. His coldness disturbed me deeply. This was not the man I thought I had married. The man I fell in love with had been kind and generous, someone who volunteered with local charities and spoke about the importance of helping those less fortunate. This new version of my husband seemed capable of cruelty I had not imagined possible. He showed no remorse about his own power and importance. I started questioning everything about the accident and the trial. The warning signs in the garage that looked too new. The testimony about Clara being told to avoid the workshop when I had never heard such instructions given. The convenient closure of the police investigation before any thorough examination of the workshop conditions could occur. My husband's immediate aggressive response to the lawsuit, rather than any attempt at compassionate resolution. The pieces did not fit together properly, and I felt growing certainty that something was being hidden. I began investigating quietly, starting with the garage workshop where Clara had died. I went out there alone one evening after my husband left for a business dinner. The space was now completely cleaned and reorganized, nothing like the cluttered equipment-filled area described in the police report. Everything was neatly stored on sturdy shelving, all tools properly secured, no obvious hazards visible. But I noticed something strange. Part of the workshop had been recently renovated, with new drywall and fresh paint that did not match the rest of the space. The renovation had occurred just days after Clara's death, supposedly to repair damage from the accident. I found this timing suspicious. Why would my husband renovate the workshop so quickly after a fatal accident, before any lawsuits had even been filed? What had been behind that new drywall? I searched through my husband's home office, looking for any records related to the workshop renovation. I found invoices from a contractor, paid in cash, for emergency repairs completed the day after Clara died. The invoices were vague about the nature of the work, listing only general terms like structural repair and hazard remediation. I hired a private investigator, using money from my personal account that my husband did not monitor. The investigator, a former police detective named Marcus, agreed to look into Clara's death and the circumstances surrounding it. I gave him copies of the police report, photographs from the trial, and the renovation invoices I had found. I asked him to determine what had really happened in that workshop and why my husband had been so desperate to avoid any serious investigation. Marcus called me 3 weeks later, his voice grim. He said he needed to meet in person to discuss what he had found. We met at a coffee shop in Clearwater, far enough from Tampa that I would not encounter anyone I knew. He slid a thick folder across the table, his expression troubled. What he had discovered explained my husband's behavior and made Clara's death infinitely more tragic. My husband had been running an illegal operation out of that garage workshop for at least 2 years. He had been manufacturing fraudulent inspection certificates for the commercial properties he managed, falsifying safety inspections and building code compliance documents to avoid the cost of actual repairs and upgrades. He had created an entire fake inspection company, complete with official-looking forms and forged inspector signatures. He charged his property management clients for legitimate inspections while pocketing the money and providing worthless fake documents. The garage workshop had been set up as a document forgery operation with industrial printers, embossing machines, and supplies for creating authentic-looking official seals. Clara had apparently discovered this operation the day she died. Marcus had tracked down a friend of Clara's who worked at another house in our neighborhood. This woman said Clara had called her that morning, upset and frightened, saying she had found something terrible in the garage and did not know what to do. Clara had planned to talk to me about it that evening when I got home from work, but Clara never got that chance. Based on the evidence Marcus uncovered, including statements from the contractor who did the emergency renovation, Clara had not fallen from shelving or a ladder. She had been standing on a platform my husband had built in the workshop's upper level, a hidden space where he stored the most incriminating documents and equipment. The platform had been poorly constructed and unstable. When Clara climbed up there to investigate what she had discovered, the platform collapsed, sending her 12 feet down onto the concrete floor. My husband had not been at a property dealing with a maintenance emergency that morning. The contractor's statement revealed that my husband had called him within an hour of Clara's fall, before the paramedics had even arrived. He had asked the contractor to come immediately and remove the platform, the forgery equipment, and any evidence of the illegal operation. The contractor had initially refused, but my husband offered him $20,000 in cash to complete the work before police arrived and to never speak about what he had seen. The contractor had agreed, spending 2 frantic hours dismantling the platform, removing all the forgery equipment and documents, and making the workshop look like a simple storage space. By the time police arrived to investigate Clara's death, all evidence of what she had actually been doing in that workshop was gone. The scene had been staged to look like she had fallen while reaching for something on a shelf, and the quick police investigation had accepted that explanation without deeper scrutiny. Marcus had tracked down this contractor after noticing his invoices in my husband's records and questioning why emergency renovation work would be done so quickly after a death. The contractor, apparently feeling guilty about his role in covering up what happened, eventually admitted everything to Marcus. He provided a detailed statement describing the forgery operation, the platform collapse, and my husband's frantic efforts to remove all evidence before authorities could see it. The wrongful death lawsuit suddenly made complete sense. Clara's family had been absolutely right that we maintained an unsafe workspace that caused her death. But they had not known about the illegal operation, had not understood the full scope of what had happened. They had filed a straightforward negligence claim based on the evidence available to them. My husband's aggressive response had not been about defending against false accusations. It had been about preventing any serious investigation that might uncover his criminal enterprise and his direct responsibility for Clara's death. The countersuit had been a strategic weapon to silence the family permanently. By bankrupting them with a judgment they could never pay, my husband ensured they would have no resources to mount further legal action. They could not afford to hire investigators or pursue appeals. The crushing financial burden would consume all their energy and attention, making it impossible for them to ever look deeper into the circumstances of Clara's death. My husband had weaponized the legal system to protect himself from criminal prosecution. I felt physically ill reading Marcus's report. My husband had caused Clara's death through his illegal operation and negligent construction. He had then orchestrated a cover-up, destroying evidence and bribing contractors to conceal his crimes. He had let an innocent woman's family be blamed for seeking justice. He had deliberately impoverished them to protect himself from exposure. Every action he had taken since Clara's death had been calculated to avoid accountability for killing her. The moment I found the evidence proving my husband was directly responsible for the maid's death, and that his lawsuit was just a calculated attempt to cover up his crime, I realized I was married to a criminal. I filed for divorce and contacted the police immediately. I need your advice. Now this is where I did that risky move. Tell me in the comments if I was right or wrong to risk my public reputation and the destruction of my family to expose the man I married, thereby bringing justice to the maid's family. I spent 2 days carefully considering my options before taking action. I could have confronted my husband privately, given him a chance to make things right somehow. I could have simply filed for divorce without exposing his crimes, protecting my children from the scandal of having their father arrested. I could have taken the evidence to Clara's family and let them decide what to do with it. Each alternative seemed safer and less destructive to my own life. But Clara had died because of my husband's illegal activity and negligence. Her family had been bankrupted and destroyed for seeking justice. Other people were at risk because the buildings my husband managed were operating with fraudulent safety certificates. Staying silent meant becoming complicit in crimes that had already caused one death and could potentially cause more. I decided the only moral choice was complete exposure, regardless of the personal cost. I contacted the state attorney's office first, requesting a meeting with a prosecutor who handled white-collar crime and corruption cases. I met with an assistant state attorney named Jennifer Ramirez, bringing all of Marcus's evidence plus the documents I had copied from my husband's office. Jennifer listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. She said the evidence strongly suggested multiple criminal charges, including manslaughter, evidence tampering, fraud, and bribery. She asked if I would be willing to cooperate fully with an investigation, including testifying against my husband if charges were filed. I agreed without hesitation. Jennifer explained that my cooperation would likely protect me from any criminal liability, as I had clearly not been aware of my husband's illegal operation and had come forward voluntarily once I discovered it. She said my husband would probably be arrested within a few weeks once they verified the evidence and secured additional witness statements. She warned me that the case would be highly public, that my family would face intense scrutiny and judgment, and that my children would have to cope with their father being prosecuted for causing someone's death. I filed for divorce that same day, hiring an attorney named Patricia Chin, who specialized in high-conflict divorces involving criminal activity. I requested emergency custody of the children, full disclosure of all my husband's assets and business dealings, and a restraining order based on concerns about his behavior once he learned I had exposed his crimes. Patricia filed all the paperwork immediately, and a process server delivered the divorce papers to my husband at his office the following afternoon. His reaction was swift and furious. He called my cell phone repeatedly, leaving increasingly angry voicemails, demanding to know what I was doing and why I had betrayed him. When I did not respond, he came to the house despite not yet being served with a restraining order. I had taken the children to my parents' home in Orlando for safety, so I was alone when he arrived. He pounded on the door, shouting that I was destroying our family over nothing, that I had lost my mind and would regret my actions. I called the police, remaining inside with the doors locked until officers arrived. They ordered my husband to leave the property, informing him that he would be arrested for trespassing if he returned. He left, but continued his attempts to contact me through text messages and emails, alternating between threats and pleas. He accused me of being vindictive and cruel, of prioritizing strangers over my own family, of failing to understand that everything he did was to protect our financial security. He never once acknowledged Clara's death or expressed any remorse for his role in it. The state attorney's office moved quickly. They executed a search warrant on my husband's business offices and our home garage workshop, seizing computers, documents, and financial records. They interviewed the contractor who had done the cover-up work, offering him immunity in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony. They examined the property management company's records, finding hundreds of fraudulent inspection certificates and evidence of systematic fraud stretching back years. They interviewed tenants and property owners who had relied on my husband's fake safety certificates, some of whom had experienced fires, floods, and other disasters due to undetected building code violations. My husband was arrested 3 weeks after I filed for divorce. He was charged with manslaughter in the second degree for Clara's death, evidence tampering, multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and racketeering. His bail was set at $500,000, which he could not immediately afford because his business accounts had been frozen as part of the criminal investigation. He spent 4 days in county jail before his parents managed to secure a bail bond. The arrest made regional and national news. The story had every element media outlets loved: a wealthy businessman, a dead immigrant maid, a massive fraud scheme, and a wife who turned in her own husband. Reporters camped outside our house in my parents' home, trying to get comments or photographs. My children's school called to discuss how to protect them from media attention and harassment from other students whose parents were following the case. My employer placed me on paid administrative leave, not as punishment, but to give me time to deal with the crisis without work obligations. I contacted Clara's family through their attorney, requesting a meeting to share what I had learned. Maria and her grandmother agreed to meet, though they were understandably suspicious of my motives. We met at their attorney's office, and I brought copies of all the evidence Marcus had gathered, the contractor's statement, and the criminal charges that had been filed against my husband. I explained everything, apologizing for not having known sooner what my husband had done, and expressing my commitment to ensuring they received justice. Maria cried as she listened, finally understanding why her mother had died and why they had been attacked so viciously in court. Her grandmother sat silently, her face showing a mixture of grief, anger, and relief. Their attorney said they wanted to file a motion to vacate the wrongful death verdict and the defamation judgment based on the newly discovered evidence of fraud and criminal activity. He said they would also file a new wrongful death suit, this time with full knowledge of my husband's illegal operation and his direct responsibility for Clara's death. I offered to testify in support of their motion and their new lawsuit. I provided them with financial records showing my husband's assets, including properties and accounts that could potentially satisfy a judgment. I told them I was divorcing my husband and would not contest any claims they made against his property or income. My role had shifted from defendant to ally, united with Clara's family in seeking accountability for the man who had caused so much harm. The motion to vacate the previous verdict was granted after a brief hearing. The judge who had presided over the original trial expressed shock and anger upon learning about the fraud and cover-up that had occurred. He vacated both the verdict in our favor on the wrongful death claim and the defamation judgment against Clara's family. He ordered my husband to immediately cease all collection efforts and formally apologized to Maria and her grandmother for the injustice they had suffered in his courtroom. The new wrongful death lawsuit moved forward quickly. My husband's criminal defense consumed all his resources and attention, leaving him unable to mount an effective civil defense. His attorney in the civil case attempted to argue that the criminal charges were unproven allegations, but the evidence was overwhelming. The contractor testified about the cover-up. I testified about my husband's behavior and the documents I had found. Building inspectors testified about the widespread fraud in safety certificates. Property owners testified about fires and structural failures that had occurred because real inspections never happened. The civil jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before awarding Clara's family $2.3 million in damages. The award included compensation for Clara's lost future earnings, pain and suffering from her death, and punitive damages based on my husband's egregious conduct in covering up his crime and then bankrupting her family to silence them. It was more money than Maria and her grandmother had ever imagined, enough to provide security for Clara's grandchildren and give the family the stability Clara had worked so hard to achieve. My husband's criminal trial occurred 8 months after his arrest. The evidence was so overwhelming that his attorney advised him to accept a plea deal rather than risk a longer sentence at trial. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter, evidence tampering, and fraud charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 12 years in prison. The judge accepted the plea but imposed a 15-year sentence, noting that my husband had caused an innocent woman's death and then systematically destroyed her family's pursuit of justice. He would serve at least 12 years before being eligible for parole. I attended the sentencing hearing, bringing photographs of Clara with my children. I wanted the judge to see Clara as a real person, someone who had been kind and gentle and loved by my kids, not just a victim in a legal proceeding. I submitted a victim impact statement on behalf of my children, describing how they had lost someone who cared for them genuinely and how they now had to cope with knowing their father had caused her death and then lied about it for years. My children struggled immensely with the revelations about their father. They had loved Clara, and learning that their father had caused her death and then attacked her family was traumatic in ways I could barely help them process. I arranged intensive therapy for both of them, working with a child psychologist who specialized in helping kids cope with parental incarceration and moral injury. The therapist explained that children whose parents commit serious crimes often experience a shattering of their worldview, a loss of trust in authority figures, and a questioning of their own identity and worth. My son, who was 12 by the time of his father's sentencing, expressed anger and shame. He felt betrayed by his father's lies and complicity in Clara's death. He struggled with questions about whether he carried his father's capacity for deception and cruelty. He worried that other kids at school judged him for his father's crimes, and he became withdrawn and defensive. Therapy helped him understand that he was not responsible for his father's choices and that character is determined by individual actions rather than inherited from parents. My daughter, who was 10, responded with confusion and sadness. She missed both Clara and her father, unable to fully reconcile the kind man who had read her bedtime stories with the person who had caused Clara's death and bankrupted her family. She had nightmares about Clara falling, about finding her father in prison, about losing me too. She needed constant reassurance that I was not going to leave her, that our home was stable, and that the terrible things that had happened were not going to keep happening. The divorce was finalized quickly, given my husband's criminal conviction. I was granted full custody with no visitation rights for my husband until he completed his prison sentence, at which point supervised visits could potentially be arranged if he completed therapy and the children agreed. I was awarded our family home and the majority of our liquid assets, though much of my husband's wealth was seized as proceeds from criminal activity or used to satisfy the judgment to Clara's family. I had enough to support my children comfortably, but not the affluent lifestyle we had previously enjoyed. I reconnected with Maria and Clara's family after the trials concluded. I wanted them to know that not everyone in my family had been complicit in my husband's crimes, that Clara had been genuinely loved by my children and remembered fondly by me. Maria was gracious and forgiving, understanding that I had also been victimized by my husband's deception. She brought her grandchildren to meet my kids, and the 4 children played together while Maria and I talked about Clara and shared memories. Maria used part of the judgment money to bring her family to the United States permanently, settling in Miami where she found work as a medical translator. She established an education fund for her children in Clara's name, ensuring they would have opportunities their grandmother had sacrificed so much to provide. She also created a small scholarship fund for other immigrant workers' children, honoring Clara's memory by helping families in similar circumstances. The justice we achieved did not bring Clara back, but it transformed her family's circumstances and gave meaning to her sacrifice. The revelation of my husband's crimes had ripple effects throughout the Tampa business community. Multiple property owners sued him and his company for the fraudulent inspection certificates, claiming damages from fires, structural failures, and other problems that proper inspections would have caught. His business partner dissolved their relationship and cooperated with investigators, providing evidence that helped identify which properties had fake certificates. Building inspectors had to re-examine hundreds of properties, many of which required expensive emergency repairs to address safety violations. My own reputation suffered despite my cooperation with authorities. Some people praised me for doing the right thing by exposing my husband's crimes. Others condemned me for betraying my spouse and destroying my children's family. I lost several friendships with people who believed wives should stand by their husbands regardless of circumstances, who thought I should have handled everything privately rather than involving police and prosecutors. I accepted these losses, recognizing that people who valued loyalty over justice were not genuinely aligned with my values anyway. My children's relationship with their father's extended family became complicated and strained. My former in-laws blamed me for their son's incarceration, insisting I should have protected him rather than exposing him. They believed family loyalty required covering up crimes and supporting each other against outside accountability. They wanted visitation with their grandchildren, but I restricted contact because they consistently made excuses for my ex-husband's behavior and tried to convince the children that their father was a victim of my vindictiveness rather than a criminal who caused someone's death. I returned to work after 3 months of leave, grateful for the structure and normalcy that my job provided. My employer had been supportive throughout the crisis, recognizing that I had done the right thing in difficult circumstances. Some colleagues treated me differently, with either excessive sympathy or awkward distance, but most simply welcomed me back and focused on work rather than personal drama. I threw myself into my job, finding comfort in the clear rules and straightforward problems of human resources management compared to the moral complexity of my personal life. Financial pressures forced us to adjust our lifestyle significantly. I sold our large house in the gated community, unable to afford the mortgage and unwilling to stay in the place where Clara had died. We moved to a modest 3-bedroom home in a working-class neighborhood, trading space and prestige for affordability and a fresh start. The kids adjusted better than I expected, finding relief in the anonymity of a place where nobody knew our history or judged us for their father's crimes. I made efforts to ensure my children understood the full truth about what had happened, presented in age-appropriate ways. I explained that their father had made very bad choices that hurt people, that he had tried to hide those choices rather than take responsibility, and that sometimes doing the right thing means holding people accountable even when they are family members you love. I emphasized that my decision to expose his crimes was about protecting others and seeking justice for Clara, not about punishing their father or destroying our family. My son asked me once if I regretted exposing his father, if I wished I had stayed silent to preserve our family. I answered honestly that I struggled with guilt about the impact on him and his sister, but that I could not have lived with myself if I had protected someone who had caused Clara's death and then destroyed her family to cover it up. I told him that integrity sometimes requires painful choices, that protecting your comfort or reputation at the expense of others' safety and justice was a moral failure I could not accept. My daughter asked different questions, focused more on feelings than ethics. She wanted to know if I still loved their father, if I was angry at him, if I missed the life we used to have. I explained that love is complicated, that I grieved for the person I thought I had married while recognizing that person had never truly existed. I said I was angry about his choices and the harm he caused, but that my primary emotion was sadness for everyone whose lives had been damaged by his actions, including Clara and her family, our children, and even my ex-husband himself, who had destroyed his own life through greed and cowardice. The question of whether I was right or wrong to expose my husband's crimes haunted me constantly. I could construct arguments on both sides. I had protected Clara's family from ongoing injustice and ensured my husband faced accountability for causing her death. I had prevented future harm by exposing his fraudulent inspection scheme. I had demonstrated to my children that ethical principles matter more than familial loyalty when serious harm is involved. These were meaningful achievements that required courage and sacrifice. But I had also shattered my children's family structure and sense of security. They would grow up with an incarcerated father, carrying the stigma and trauma that accompanies parental criminality. They had lost their comfortable lifestyle and their place in the community we had been part of. They would struggle with trust and relationship issues, wondering if people they love might also be concealing terrible secrets. The damage I caused to my own children, even in service of justice for Clara's family, weighed heavily on me. 5 years after Clara's death and my decision to expose my husband, I watched my children at a family gathering at Maria's home in Miami. They were playing with Clara's grandchildren, now teenagers, navigating their own complicated feelings about the tragedy that had shaped all their lives. My son was 17, preparing for college with plans to study criminal justice. My daughter was 15, writing poetry and short stories that processed her experiences with themes of betrayal, justice, and moral complexity. Maria and I had developed an unexpected friendship, bonded by shared trauma and mutual respect. She thanked me periodically for giving her family justice, for ensuring Clara's death was not forgotten or dismissed. She acknowledged the cost I had paid, the sacrifice of my marriage, and my children's relationship with their father. She expressed hope that someday our shared pain would transform into something meaningful, perhaps advocacy work to protect immigrant workers or reforms to ensure workplace deaths receive proper investigation. I thought often about Clara, about the person she had been and the life she should have lived. She had been 54 when she died, with potentially 2 more decades ahead of her. She should have retired to Guatemala, watched her grandchildren grow up, enjoyed the fruits of her decades of hard work. Instead, she had died because my husband built an illegal operation in our garage and constructed a faulty platform to hide his documents. Her death had been preventable, senseless, the result of one man's greed and willingness to cut corners. My ex-husband became eligible for parole after serving 8 years of his 15-year sentence. He had completed every rehabilitation program available in prison, earned a college degree through correspondence courses, and expressed remorse in parole hearings. The parole board granted his release with strict conditions, including restitution payments, regular check-ins with a parole officer, and restrictions on the types of work he could pursue. He moved to Jacksonville, working in manual labor and living in a small efficiency apartment. He requested contact with the children after his release. My son, now 20 years old and in college, declined any relationship. He said he had processed his feelings about his father through therapy and personal reflection and had decided that maintaining distance was healthiest for him. He bore no ill will but also felt no obligation to rebuild a relationship with someone whose choices had caused so much harm. My daughter, 18 and preparing for college herself, agreed to meet her father once, a supervised visit in a neutral location. The meeting was brief and awkward. My ex-husband apologized, expressing remorse for his crimes and acknowledging the pain he had caused. My daughter listened politely but remained emotionally distant, her boundaries clear and firm. She told him she was glad he had served his time and hoped he would make better choices going forward, but that she was not interested in an ongoing relationship. She said she wished him well, but that he was essentially a stranger to her now. Someone from her childhood whose actions had taught her important lessons about integrity, but who no longer had a role in her life. I never saw my ex-husband again after his release. We communicated occasionally through attorneys regarding final financial matters and legal obligations, but we had no direct contact. The man I had loved and married felt like a character from someone else's story, a cautionary tale about how well you can think you know someone while remaining completely ignorant of their true nature. I had spent over 15 years married to him, raised children with him, built a life with him, and yet I had not known the most fundamental truth about his character, that he valued money and self-preservation more than human life. The question remained unanswerable even years later. Had I been right to expose him? My children were damaged but alive and safe. Clara's family had received justice and financial security. My ex-husband had faced accountability for his crimes. These were real, meaningful outcomes, but my children had also lost their father, their financial security, and their innocence about human nature. They carried scars that would shape their entire lives, wounds that might never fully heal. My name is finally clear. The Maid's family is compensated, and my children are safe, but the silence in my life is deafening. I sent the father of my children to prison for his crimes against an innocent woman. I know I will never trust a long-term partner again. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to execute this final revenge, because this decision broke the last thread of connection we had. Was the justice I found for the Maid's family worth the complete, final destruction of my own home? The answer shifts depending on which lens I use to examine the question. From Clara's family's perspective, I gave them justice they desperately deserved and could never have achieved without my cooperation. From my children's perspective, I destroyed their family structure to uphold abstract principles about accountability. From society's perspective, I prevented future harm by exposing a dangerous fraud scheme. From my ex-husband's perspective, I betrayed the person who trusted me most. Each viewpoint is valid, each contains truth, and none provides a definitive answer about whether my choice was ultimately right or wrong. What I know with certainty is that staying silent would have been its own form of betrayal. Clara had died in my home while working for my family. Her family had been bankrupted and humiliated while seeking justice for her death. Other people were at risk from the fraudulent inspections my husband had certified. Choosing to protect my own comfort and my children's stability at the expense of these other considerations would have made me complicit in my husband's crimes. I would have become an accomplice after the fact, someone who knew the truth and chose concealment over accountability. But I also know that my decision to expose everything carried costs that extended far beyond my own suffering. My children paid the highest price for my moral choice. They lost their father not to death or divorce alone, but to criminal conviction and imprisonment. They grew up knowing their father had caused an innocent woman's death and then destroyed her family to cover it up. They learned that the people you love most can betray fundamental moral principles, that trust is fragile and relationships are conditional. These lessons served them well in developing strong ethical frameworks, but they also damaged their capacity for uncomplicated joy and security. My son wrote about his experience in his college application essay, describing how his father's crimes and my decision to expose them had shaped his understanding of justice and personal responsibility. He wrote about the complexity of loving someone while condemning their actions, about the difference between familial loyalty and moral complicity. His essay was powerful and mature, reflecting deep thought about difficult ethical questions. But reading it broke my heart because it revealed how much mental and emotional energy he had devoted to processing trauma that should never have been part of his childhood. My daughter expressed her experiences through creative writing, producing stories and poems that explored themes of betrayal, justice, and the cost of truth-telling. Her work was sophisticated and emotionally resonant, earning her recognition in young writers' competitions and acceptance to a prestigious creative writing program. But her art was born from pain, from processing experiences that had forced her to confront moral complexity and human weakness far earlier than any child should have to. Her talent was undeniable, but I would have traded every award and achievement for her to have had a simpler, happier childhood. I attended therapy regularly throughout these years, working to process my own guilt and grief about the choices I had made. My therapist helped me understand that moral certainty is often illusory, that complex situations rarely have clear right answers. She pointed out that I had gathered information, consulted with legal and ethical advisors, and made the best decision I could with the resources available. She reminded me that my children were resilient and that processing difficult truths, while painful, ultimately contributed to their development as thoughtful, ethical people. But therapy could not erase my doubts or provide definitive answers. I still woke some nights replaying the moment I decided to contact the state attorney's office, wondering what would have happened if I had chosen differently. I imagined alternate timelines where I confronted my husband privately, where we worked out some arrangement that provided compensation to Clara's family without criminal prosecution. These fantasies always fell apart when I remembered that my husband had shown no remorse, had been actively pursuing collection of the judgment against Clara's family, and had built his entire response around avoiding accountability rather than making amends. The reality was that my husband's character made compromise impossible. He was not someone who would have voluntarily done the right thing if given the opportunity. He had already demonstrated his priorities by covering up Clara's death, destroying evidence, bribing contractors, and then bankrupting her family to silence them. Expecting him to suddenly develop a conscience and make things right was naive fantasy. The only way to achieve justice was through external enforcement, through criminal prosecution and civil litigation that he could not manipulate or escape. I reconnected with the contractor who had initially helped cover up Clara's death and later provided testimony against my husband. His name was Robert, and he had struggled tremendously with guilt about his role in the cover-up. He had spent years in therapy processing his choice to accept money in exchange for destroying evidence and lying about what he had seen. He told me that testifying against my husband had been a form of redemption, a way to partially atone for his own moral failure in the immediate aftermath of Clara's death. Robert and I met occasionally for coffee, two people who had both been caught up in my ex-husband's crimes and were trying to make sense of our roles in the tragedy. Robert described the intense pressure my husband had applied, the threats combined with financial incentives, the frantic energy that had made clear something terrible would happen if he did not cooperate. He said he had rationalized his choice by telling himself the woman was already dead, that nothing he did would change that outcome, and that refusing would only destroy his own life without helping anyone. I understood his rationalization because I had engaged in similar mental gymnastics when trying to decide whether to expose my husband. The temptation to prioritize self-preservation and family protection over abstract principles of justice and accountability was powerful. Robert had succumbed to that temptation initially, and it had haunted him ever since. His experience reinforced my belief that I had made the right choice, even if the consequences were painful. Living with the guilt of protecting my husband's crimes would have been worse than living with the grief of exposing them. My parents provided crucial support throughout this period, offering both emotional comfort and practical assistance. They helped with childcare, financial support during the transition, and simply being present during the darkest moments. My mother told me repeatedly that she was proud of my courage, that doing the right thing when it cost you everything was the truest test of character. My father, more practical and less effusive, ensured I had competent legal representation and sound financial advice as I navigated the divorce and its aftermath. But my parents also struggled with their own feelings about what had happened. They had liked my ex-husband, had welcomed him into the family, and trusted him with their daughter and grandchildren. Learning that he had been capable of causing someone's death and then systematically destroying their family challenged their own judgment and made them question how they had failed to see his true nature. They felt guilty about not having recognized warning signs, about not having protected me and the children from someone who turned out to be dangerous. I tried to reassure them that my ex-husband had been skilled at deception, that he had fooled many people, including me, who had been married to him for over 15 years. His crimes had been carefully concealed, his public persona had been convincing, and there had been no obvious red flags that should have alerted anyone to his capacity for such behavior. But my parents still carried guilt, still wondered if they had been too accepting, too willing to see what they wanted to see rather than questioning more deeply. The relationship between my children and their paternal grandparents remained strained and minimal. My former in-laws had initially been supportive during the early stages of my ex-husband's prosecution, expressing shock and dismay at the revelations about his crimes. But as the reality of his lengthy prison sentence set in, they shifted to a defensive posture, minimizing his responsibility and suggesting I had overreacted by involving criminal authorities rather than handling everything privately. Their attempts to maintain a relationship with my children were hampered by their inability to acknowledge the full truth of what their son had done. They wanted to present him as someone who had made mistakes but was fundamentally good, someone who deserved forgiveness and family support. My children, particularly my son, could not accept this narrative. He needed his grandparents to acknowledge that their son had caused Clara's death and then deliberately destroyed her family, that these were not minor mistakes, but serious crimes that reflected profound character flaws. The impasse became unbridgeable. My former in-laws felt I had poisoned the children against their father and prevented them from maintaining family relationships. My children felt their paternal grandparents were asking them to excuse inexcusable behavior and pretend their father was a victim rather than a perpetrator. Eventually, contact dwindled to occasional birthday cards and holiday greetings, superficial gestures that maintained the thinnest veneer of family connection without any genuine relationship. I dated briefly a few years after the divorce, attempting to build a new romantic relationship with a man I met through work. David was kind and patient, a divorced father who understood the complexities of rebuilding life after family trauma. We enjoyed each other's company and shared similar values about parenting and personal integrity. But I found myself unable to fully trust him, constantly vigilant for signs of deception or hidden darkness. Every small inconsistency in his stories triggered suspicion. Every moment when he was not immediately reachable prompted worst-case scenarios in my mind. David eventually ended the relationship, gently explaining that my inability to trust made genuine intimacy impossible. He said he understood why I struggled, that my experiences had given me every reason to be cautious, but that he could not sustain a relationship where he was constantly being evaluated for evidence of hidden crimes or moral failings. He wished me well and expressed hope that someday I would heal enough to risk vulnerability again. I appreciated his kindness, but also felt relief when the relationship ended, recognizing I was not ready for partnership and might never be. My therapist suggested that my difficulty trusting romantic partners was not just about my ex-husband's betrayal, but also about my own guilt and self-doubt. I had lived with someone for 15 years without recognizing his capacity for causing harm and then covering it up. This failure of perception made me question my own judgment fundamentally. If I could be so wrong about someone I loved and saw every day, how could I trust myself to accurately assess anyone else's character? The betrayal had damaged not just my ability to trust others, but my ability to trust my own discernment. This insight was valuable but did not provide an easy solution. Rebuilding trust in my own judgment required time and consistent evidence that I could make good decisions about people and situations. Small successes accumulated slowly, choosing good friends who proved trustworthy over years, making sound decisions at work about hiring and personnel issues, guiding my children through their own relationship challenges with advice that served them well. Each positive outcome slightly strengthened my confidence in my ability to assess character and make appropriate choices. But romantic relationships remained beyond my capacity. The vulnerability required for intimate partnership felt impossibly risky. I had built a full life centered on my children, my work, my friendships, and my advocacy efforts. Adding a romantic partner seemed unnecessary and potentially dangerous, introducing variables I could not control and risks I could not tolerate. I accepted that this was a permanent limitation, a scar from my ex-husband's betrayal that would never fully heal. I was content alone, and contentment seemed sufficient. The 10th anniversary of Clara's death brought all the principals in the tragedy together for a memorial service. Maria organized the event in Tampa, wanting to honor her mother in the city where she had died and where justice had eventually been achieved. She invited me and my children, extending grace that I still struggled to feel I deserved. We attended along with several of Clara's other friends and former employers, people whose lives she had touched during her years in Florida. The service was held in a small Catholic church in a predominantly Latino neighborhood. Maria spoke about her mother's sacrifice and determination, her commitment to providing her family with opportunities she had never had. Clara's grandchildren, now young adults, shared memories passed down through family stories and photographs. Several of Clara's former employers spoke about her kindness, reliability, and the joy she brought to their homes. The portrait that emerged was of a woman who had worked hard, loved deeply, and deserved so much better than the death she received. My daughter read a poem she had written about Clara, describing childhood memories of her gentleness and the grief of losing her. She acknowledged the complexity of Clara's death and the painful process of learning the truth about what had happened. She expressed gratitude that justice had eventually been achieved, even though it came too late to bring Clara back and required sacrifices that wounded everyone involved. Her poem was beautiful and heartbreaking, capturing the impossible tangle of emotions that characterized our shared experience. After the service, Maria approached me privately. She thanked me again for my courage in exposing my husband's crimes and ensuring her family received justice. She acknowledged the cost I had paid, the destruction of my marriage, and the trauma to my children. She said she hoped I did not carry guilt about my choices, that from her perspective I had done the only right thing possible in impossible circumstances. Her words were generous and absolving, but they could not eliminate my doubts about whether the outcome had been worth the cost. I asked Maria if she thought Clara would have wanted me to expose my husband, if she had known it would result in my children losing their father and our family being destroyed. Maria considered the question seriously before responding. She said her mother had been a deeply moral person who believed in accountability and justice, but who also valued family and would have been heartbroken about any children suffering. She said Clara would probably have struggled with the same questions I struggled with, uncertain about the right choice, but ultimately believing that truth and justice mattered more than comfort or convenience. This answer was both reassuring and unsatisfying. It confirmed that the moral complexity I grappled with was genuine, that reasonable people could disagree about the best course of action in such circumstances. It validated my choice while acknowledging its costs, but it also reinforced that there was no clear right answer, no choice that would have prevented harm and achieved justice without sacrifice. The situation my ex-husband created had been a moral trap, a scenario where every option led to pain and loss. My children graduated high school and moved on to college and adult lives, carrying the marks of their childhood trauma, but also demonstrating remarkable resilience and strength. My son became a family law attorney, specializing in protecting children in custody disputes, using his own experiences to fuel passionate advocacy for vulnerable kids caught in adult conflicts. My daughter became a writer and therapist, helping others process trauma through creative expression and professional counseling. Both had transformed their pain into purpose, finding meaning in their suffering by using it to help others. They maintained minimal contact with their father, brief conversations a few times per year that fulfilled obligation without seeking genuine relationship. They had processed their feelings about him through therapy and personal reflection, arriving at a place of acceptance without forgiveness. They understood he was a flawed person who had made terrible choices, and they wished him well while maintaining firm boundaries. They did not need him in their lives, and felt no guilt about that decision. I retired from my human resources position at 62, ready to step back from the corporate world and focus on advocacy work that felt more meaningful. I volunteered with organizations supporting immigrant workers' rights, workplace safety initiatives, and criminal justice reform. I spoke publicly about my experience, sharing my story to illustrate the importance of accountability and the complexity of making moral choices when they conflict with personal interests. Some people praised my courage, while others condemned my betrayal of family, but I had learned to accept that I could not control others' judgments. Looking back across the years since Clara's death and my decision to expose my husband's crimes, I still could not say with certainty whether I had been right or wrong. The question remained unanswerable because it depended on which values you prioritized and which outcomes you weighted most heavily. If you valued justice and accountability above all else, I had made the right choice by ensuring my husband faced consequences and Clara's family received compensation. If you valued family stability and children's well-being above all else, I had made the wrong choice by exposing crimes that resulted in my children losing their father. The truth was that both values mattered, that justice and family well-being were both important, and that situations forcing you to choose between them were tragedies regardless of which option you selected. My ex-husband had created this tragedy through his crimes and his determination to avoid accountability. I had navigated it as best I could, making choices that aligned with my values about truth and justice, even when those choices came at tremendous personal cost. Whether those were the right choices or the wrong ones, I would never know with certainty. What I did know was that I could live with the choices I made. I could look at myself in the mirror and accept the person I saw, someone who had prioritized justice over comfort, who had refused to be complicit in covering up crimes, who had ensured an innocent woman's family received accountability for her death. I had paid a high price for those choices, and my children had paid an even higher one. But the alternative, protecting my husband and allowing Clara's family to suffer in silence, would have required me to become someone I could not respect. My children had grown into remarkable adults with strong moral compasses and deep compassion for others. They understood that doing the right thing often came at a cost, that integrity sometimes required sacrifice, and that choosing the harder path could be necessary even when the easier one was tempting. These lessons had come through pain and loss, but they had shaped my children into people I was profoundly proud of. Whether the lessons were worth the cost of learning them, I still did not know. Clara remained present in our lives through memory and through our ongoing relationship with her family. Maria and I spoke regularly, sharing updates about our children and supporting each other through life's challenges. Our friendship had been forged through shared tragedy, and it carried both the weight of that tragedy and the hope that something meaningful could emerge from terrible circumstances. We both lived with questions about whether the justice we achieved was worth what it cost, and we both knew those questions would never be fully resolved. The silence in my house was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the silence of hard-won peace. I had built a life defined by my choices rather than by my ex-husband's crimes. I had relationships based on honesty rather than deception. I had purpose derived from helping others avoid or navigate similar tragedies. The life I had was not the one I had planned or imagined, but it was authentic and meaningful in ways my previous life had never been. Was I right or wrong to expose my husband's crimes, to pursue justice for Clara's family, even though it meant destroying my own? The question echoed through my life, unanswerable and essential. All I could say with certainty was that I had made the choice I could live with, the choice that aligned with my deepest values about accountability and truth. Whether it was the right choice or the wrong one, whether the justice I found was worth the complete destruction of my home, these were questions I would carry forever. And perhaps that uncertainty, that inability to know whether I chose wisely, was itself the truest cost of my ex-husband's betrayal and my decision to expose it.